Well, I want to set the stage by asking the first question to everyone. Of course, okay, so the session will go like that. I will ask a question. I will most likely direct to someone, but if the rest of the panelists, you feel that there's a need to, you have something burning in your heart to share, please feel free to just come in, okay? So I want to address this to Richard. I think Richard shared very well about the nature of open source and how is it going to affect the future development of our some of the things new things that's happening. So maybe I just want to ask, I mean, since you are from the FOSS community, how's the adoption today? Like, are there still a lot of fears? And also, if you talk about some of the uncaught fears, like people who are not adopting open source, what are the myths? Now, what are uncaught fears today that you can see in the market?
Yeah, so definitely I've been, almost like in the forefront of experiencing the change in attitude towards open source, right? So when we first started, there were a lot of worries, about open source. I think Siva has mentioned some of those, right? Fundamentally, people thought that open source is less secure, right? And they are worried that whether is it going to be enterprise grade, yeah. But through the years, this set of attitudes have changed in the sense that today, if you look at the banks, right, I can tell you that none of the banks are not using open source software. None of the telcos are not using open source software, right? Open source has become part and parcel of enterprise, technology stack. Yeah, and the reason is very simple, right? If there's a concern about open source being less secure, right, and that actually stems from the fact that I think some people are suggesting, right, because I can see the source code, so people can try to hack the software, right? On the contrary, we believe that with the source codes being available to everyone, that means it's much easier for defects to be found, for vulnerability to be fixed, because you have a lot more eyes looking at it than just a pair of developers who is building these codes and keeping it in the safe, right? So, and the fact is that hackers usually don't need access to the source codes for hacking, right? They have automated tools to actually help them probe different pieces of software through the network to find out vulnerabilities. And it doesn't mean that they have source codes and it will be easier for them to hack. Yeah. So, but that has been pretty much a given today, right? Because a lot of enterprises are using open source software. So security is less of a concern today, right? There might be some questions on whether is open source enterprise ready, right? I think we just need to take a quick look around us, right? If you look at people like Google, Amazon, and Netflix, they're all running on open source. Yeah, and the scale of their business operations is much bigger than typical traditional enterprises. So is it enterprise ready? I'll argue that it definitely is, right? In fact, people like Google, Amazon, and Netflix wouldn't have even come to existence without open source. That's because the traditional model of software, where you pay huge amounts of money, to the proprietary software vendors, right, have existed last time, but it's not viable for this kind of new age and highly or hyper scale kind of companies, because then most of their profits that they're making is going to go into these software vendors, right? So that doesn't make sense at all, and that's why they leverage, right, their business model on using open source software, and they have done so very, very successfully. Another common question, sorry, Matas, just a last one. A common question which I've encountered is that people, some people were assuming that if I build my application on top of open source tools, that means they will have to expose the source codes that they have built, right? Which is entirely not true, right? We have a lot of enterprises that actually build their own applications and services on top of open source infrastructure, like what Siva has mentioned, right? As long as you don't alter the source codes of the open source components that you're using, right? You're using it internally to support your business, you're free to keep the source codes to yourself, and you don't have to expose it to anyone. So these are the three main questions, right, that I've encountered over the years.
That's very good. Okay, so I saw a few questions, a number of questions coming in. I like one of the questions that was being asked. I think it's all same points, so I'm going to combine them into one. Let me just use lock, stock, barrel, what was being asked. There are some genius code, fantastic coder, but I cannot find the documentation to help me understand what a spark is. So are there any practice right now that you want to ensure that the code produced also ensure the accompanying documentation that comes along with it? Well, I'm going to defer this question to Mei Hui, but feel free to jump in, any panelists. Okay, so Mei Hui, what do you think? Oh, sorry, you're mute. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, didn't realize that I'll mute. So in terms of that, definitely that I think that I do not think that there's any sort of fixed recommendation that they must, you know, like for developer to give their documentation to what level of detail or content. It's more of actually a lot could be just very basic documentation and could be haphazard. So there's no fixed guideline. So of course, from a user and developer perspective, it's definitely great to have, you know, software that is well documented and easy to use, easy to edit. That would be the ideal case. So I would think that actually one of the highlight of community is that if the software is used by more people and more people are contributing back, naturally the documentation would be much better. So like for me personally, I use a lot of open source software that is based for the machine learning and Python. So a lot of them are actually very well documented because of the large community that is maintaining. So I can't say for some of the other applications that this is possible. So of course, hopefully it can be more streamlined. But that's actually I would say a good concern, because even in terms of actually what I mentioned just now, that documentation could be actually one of the challenges for people to use the software, especially if you have to comply to some of the audit purposes, because there are things that may not be accounted for, and that could eventually in future serve as an audit point or issue.
Actually,
maybe
that's
just to
sorry, please, Siva.
yeah, just to maybe add on a little bit there. I think it's interesting, right? The whole point about documentation, and if you talk about 15, 16 years ago, when at least I started delving into open source from a professional perspective, yes, documentation was hard, and it's not easy to find, especially if you're trying to develop like fairly unique projects, right, or rare projects that the business needed at that point in time, and it's hard to use. That said, right, it's really dependent on the PTL, the project technology lead, right, of that particular open source project to ensure the quality of the documentation that accompanies the code, right? And it's not so much the vendor per se. The vendor would enhance the documentation that's already available, yes, but generally documentation to the code is usually provided by the coder himself. There are many times that in the popular open source projects, right? Let's say, for example, in Linux, code commits will get rejected if they're not documented properly, right? So it's really up to the PTLs to kind of enforce that documentation hygiene, which personally I think is very important, and it's key to attracting more people to develop on the software in the first place. If not, guess what? If there's no documentation, even if I wanted to contribute, it's going to be very difficult for me to contribute, right? So that's where I would suggest that it's really dependent on the project and the project lead leading that particular project.
Yeah, so I was about to say just now, when C was coming in, that when we are in school, right, number one thing that we know about coding is always documentation, because nobody is going to take over your code, understand what on earth do you write. But you know that there are genius people who they think faster than they talk, and sometimes they will code faster than even what they want to write, because it's a flow. The Hong, like flow, you must keep typing, and you must keep coding. You have no time for documentation. But this is a real problem. So is it because I follow through the panelist discussion, right? Is it because there's a lack of talent for capability and patience to scrutinize this documentation, this code, or is it because there's a lack of standards? Is it like, should we actually impose some standards so that when you launch this open source code, you should have documentation everywhere? Now, what do you think?
Perhaps that could be an open source project by itself. No, seriously, I think it's a good idea for open source project, right? And then you'll need to influence the popular open source projects to adopt it. I think that would be it would be a easy way for project leads to then adopt, I would say.
Okay. Okay. So just to follow up that question, he was asking also, do you think that we have lack of the talent to really scrutinize and govern code? Or is there a challenge today? What do you think? Or do you observe that there's a problem today?
Well, Matthias, from where I come, right? In fact, there's not only a lack of talent with that specific capability. I think there's a general lack of, in-depth technical talents in the first place, right? But I do see that, the government is actually putting a lot of focus in terms of building up this kind of capability, which is a very positive thing, right? Because in a smart nation, you don't just hire a bunch of talents from elsewhere to run it, right? So you need to develop your own so that you have a sustainable way of injecting your own innovation and also growing from there, right? So in short, yes, there is a shortage of talent, and to me, it's not only a problem that Singapore is trying to grapple with. It's a problem for the entire industry, right? And this starts with the education system. You remember the days when we were studying, right? I'm not sure about you, but it's been decades, since I last opened up a textbook. But when it comes to software development, right, we are only taught coding, right? We were not taught about much else, right? In terms of how to scrutinize, how to do proper testing, how to do documentation, how to writes, let's say, fixes, so on and so forth. Yeah. So, but slowly, I think we are starting to appreciate that actually software engineering is a pretty niche skill on its own, like any other engineering discipline, and it's not just software development. Even if with software development, there's also specific way of writing code, right? And certain individuals can write better codes than the others, right? So there are definitely best practices that we can actually learn from one another. So guidelines help, right? But I would say that by and large, a focus and push in terms of getting the nation, right, to be aware that this is a core skill sets, that will be able to add value to not only the individuals but also to the development of the country. Is very important to encourage stronger participation, right, in helping to resolve this issue, right, with insufficient talent in this space. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, I got another question here. This is more to OpenTrace. Okay, since OpenTrace code is only version 1, would there be improvement to TraceTogether to upstream to OpenTrace? Well, I will say this, that I don't think the panel can answer this because this is on OpenTrace community, the developer. So I will just give a pass for this. But great question. Thank you so much. Okay, so following on the question, no code that is put on open source license has any restriction on use on a commercial setting. That only is a statement more than a question, but I would like to ask if the panel have anything to add to this. Maybe I'll refer this to Siva. What do you think?
Oh,
no
sure.
code that's put on open source license has any restriction on the use in a commercial setting.
That's correct, right? Generally speaking, of course, if someone releases a code in open source and in some form of open source license, any organization can just take it and use it, whether it's commercial or not, right? I think what Mei Hui was referring to earlier was really about the software that is being compiled and then used, and that may have commercial implications if someone uses the software, not just the source code, right, per se. So that's where I think the comment was directed at, which is accurate.
Well, I see a lot more questions. Guys, if I cannot get all to your question, apologies for that because the questions are coming in. I think there's a lot of supporter for programmers. I can see that comments was like, programmers hate documentation. Forget it, man. Break the flow. Some are genius coders are bad in other areas. You know what? Don't talk about documentation to me. If they don't understand the code, too bad. Well, I can see a lot of programmers that are on this chapter today discussion. I don't blame them. I was a programmer once. I hate to sit down and write down what, if you don't understand, it shows your lack of knowledge. But I think that shouldn't be the way. Of course, we need to have certain level of documentation. Okay, let's just go to the question straight, okay? So this question, using open source software and get vendor to support, we often get vendor lock-in, like using the proprietary software. Can we have a software escrow through this third party by using open source?
Actually, what do you mean by escrow? That's a software escrow.
Okay, from
That's
looking at
something that
what
I
he
was
was
trying to
asking,
understand.
Yeah, maybe I can second guess. Like, it says that because if you get a vendor to support, they will use a proprietary software. I think that is what he meant. In the end, you want to support open source. Now, can you just have a software escrow in the middle that says that, hey, I will help you to support this open source without any using support proprietary software? Is there a possibility to do that?
I think if that's the case, right, there are possibilities for people to do that, but in reality, you're still going to pay that whoever that third party is to support that software, right? And whether that person can really support the software would be questionable, because a lot of support for open source software happens in the open source space, right? If a person or if an organization wants to take up the support of open source software, I would highly encourage that particular organization to actually actively contribute into the projects that they're supporting. Because guess what? The next thing you know, there's a bug in the software, you are actually liable for support. But how do you support it without going back to the open source community to generate a fix? It's going to be impossible, right? And how then do you take accountability for that? So yes, it's possible, right? And if you talk about the lock-in, it's a common question, right? I mean, we used to all the time say that using open source means that you are preventing any vendor lock-in. But I get what the question is about. Why is there vendor lock-in when you use open source? Yes and no, right? Yes, in the sense that you're going to be using that software, and to migrate off that software would be a migration process, generally speaking. But that said, most open source software licenses enable the user to actually stop subscribing to the software, right? And then they have a choice on whether they want to do it or not, right? If, of course, the choice is not to, let's say, for example, pay the vendor, then they run the risk of supporting it themselves, but they have the ability and the choice to do so, right? Once again, they need to understand the risks.
Yeah, sorry.
Continue, please. Yeah.
Maybe just to add on, I think if you are using open source software and getting a vendor to support it, and if it's still an open source software, I don't think there's a need for escrow to be applied, because you have ready access to the source codes already, right? So escrow is needed when you're prevented from access to this object, right? Be it a software or whatever, and you will have access to it upon a condition, right? Maybe if the company goes bankrupt or whatever, right? So, but in this particular case, you have ready access to the source codes since it's open source software. So no escrow probably is not necessary in such a scenario.
Okay. Okay, I have a question. I don't know why, but the attendees private WhatsApp me. Okay, so what is the difference in development cost to use open source versus you develop yourself a customized software? I think it's an interesting question. From your experience, maybe from the team, maybe anyone who can take on this? I will repeat the question again.
Repeat the question, yeah.
Yeah, the question is, what is the difference in the development cost? That means the difference in getting the things out in a cost manner to use an open source versus customized software, or you code yourself. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe I'll try to take that, and then the rest of the panelists can definitely add on. Okay, my opinion, right? And this really depends. When I want to start a project and make it open source, I'm actually investing the effort into creating version 1 of that software and putting it in the open source space, or version 0.1 or whatever version that is, right? And putting it in the open source space. It then becomes my responsibility to go and market my project as something that other people would be interested to work on as well, right? So that I can actually get more and more developers to actively contribute to the project, to that particular project. And this will then inherently lower my cost structure of developing a full-blown product whilst leveraging on other. And of course, because I'm not paying those developers, my cost would be then lower. But that said, I would also caution against that, because you still have to think about marketing your particular open source project in a way that would attract the people, right? And there is cost involved in that as well, in some form or other, right? It may not be dollars and cents, but it could be time, it could be effort, it could be going to different mailing lists and populating them and trying to get people onto your project.
Okay. Okay, I've got a question directed. I think it should direct to Mei Hui. Just a quick question. Is open source really okay? I think this answer already is more trustworthy than closed source, right? But what, in your opinion, should be open source and what should be closed source, in your opinion? Yeah, I think because there's a lot of support on open source today, but of course, to be real, right, to have a reality check, we also need to have some closed source. So what should be open source and what should be closed source?
Okay, this one is of course my personal opinion and based on my experience as well. So personally, I feel that for certain more sensitive industries, if in terms of if you are having a lot of regulatory compliance, then sometimes closed source may be a better option because you have more control over actually what are some of the settings you can have in order to get past your compliance and not have a lot of red flags. So that's one. And of course, I'm not saying that open source does not have that option, because you can definitely hire developers to make use of the software to the purpose that you need. So I would feel that in terms of assurance, maybe in that perspective, then that would be one of the considerations why people would go closed source instead of open source.
Okay, sure. Hey, that's a fantastic answer. Okay, so let's today we Catherine was telling me that someone raised his hand. I think it's Darren. May feel free to unmute him and he can ask anything in this chapter or in this discussion. Oh, it's okay. You're saying press wrong button. No worries. Thank you so much. Okay, so there was another question from the floor. Okay, is open source? Okay, this is, I think the answer will of course be yes, but I want to hear provocative answers. Okay, is open source sustainable? Is it really usable for IoT in future? How about connected device, connected security? Really open source? You sure? Okay, I use some dramatic tone, but I want to ask the panelists, is it true? Is really sustainable for all these like IoTs, connected device and security?
Yeah, so Matthias, in short, right, I think open source is the most sustainable model of software. In fact, in recent years, yes, been proven even more so, right? Well, I would say that is sustainable as a model. I'm not referring to any particular project, right? Because it has always got to do with demand and supply, right? So certain problems that are more serious will attract more talents coming in together to fix the problem, right? And if it's a big problem, more people will tend to use it, to solve their issues. And in turn, right, it will generate additional interest in making the project even more vibrant, right? So definitely vibrancy of a open source project differs from one to the other, right? So that's also one of the key reasons why, if you are dabbling into open source project, please spend time, to explore around in the community, understand, how are the releases being managed, who are the contributors, how often is it being updated, right? So that is a very important part of making a decision of whether to use the open source project or not, right? So, but the nature of demand and supply is very useful in the sense that if there's a certain project that isn't helpful in terms of fixing problems, very soon it'll die out on its own, right? So, to me, it is the best way of achieving a balance, right? Bigger problems will attract more interest and will attract more contributions. Everybody come together and fix the problem, and you will continue to be sustainable in that way, right? So, but what constitutes a problem now might not be the same 5, 6, or 10 years later, right? So new problems will emerge, and there will be new projects that are being started, to fix all these problems. So if you ask me, in short, I think open source is a very sustainable way in terms of building software solutions to address issues and problems, right? But it might not be applied across all the different open source projects that there are out there in the market right now.
Okay, I think this session has come to a very interesting point that some of the attendees actually have comments. So if you have something
But
that you
it's
want to
very
answer,
soft.
Oh, can you hear me? Is it better?
Was it me?
Is it better?
No, still same, a little bit soft. Yeah.
Okay, let me shout. Is it better?
Yes.
Wow. Okay, Murphy's Law is at play today. Okay, the session of this webinar has come to a very interesting point that some of the attendees, right, they have comments also. So if you have comments, I would love you to just, I want to make it discussion, really discussion. If you have interesting comment, raise up your hands. If it's accident, it's okay. We will just unmute you back. But if it's something that you want to share, please feel free to raise up your hands, and I think Catherine will just let me know so that we can unmute you, okay? So there was a question. Is there a channel in Singapore to understand the terms and conditions for GPL3? So I know that one of the attendees, Harish, may want to be interested to answer the question. Feel free. But if not, attendees, any answers from you?
I would say there's channels. If you want, there will be people who can talk about it. I mean, for example, Red Hat, within Red Hat itself, Harish is a big proponent of open source, and he can explain the GPL. And I'm taking the liberty to talk on his behalf because he's the guy who taught me what GPL was, right? So, and I understood it from him. But that's it. There will be legal counsel and stuff like that who actually can explain this pretty well. I think within Red Hat and others. So yes, if you want, feel free to ask, and we'll try to see to that request if possible.
Okay, good, very good. Okay, so just going back again to one of the question, right, regarding IoTs. Do you think that they are ready for open source? I mean, some of the questions from the panelists, right? Connected device, security. I know just now, Richard gave a very good last slide to say that where is it going to? One of them is big data analysis, automation. But how about IoTs? How about connected device? How about autonomous vehicles, like what Xiao Fei will be in charge of, the autonomous vehicles running on the cars and on the road, those things that potentially, how about critical infrastructures, those things that could potentially affect our life? Do you think open source is great in that area?
Well, let me jump in again, right? So if you look at the world's network, right, it's all run by routers and switches. Guess what is it running on? Yeah, it's usually Linux boxes. Yeah, Linux codes. Yeah. So that is open source, right? So if open source has already been proven to be, used in such critical mass, in such scale, I find it difficult to see, right, any other ways of developing software for the IoT world, because it's going to be equally massive, right, in terms of the number of devices that is going to be released, so on and so forth, right? And to the question of the critical infrastructure, isn't it even more important, to hold on to the destiny of your critical infrastructure, to know what is actually running your critical infrastructure, right? So is there any other options outside of open source?
Yeah,
Okay.
just to add on to that, right? I think IoT is a use case that, in my opinion, having a non-open source development model is just destined for disaster. IoT is not just about the specific device that's going out into the system, into the ecosystem, right? There is an ecosystem at play, and having that ecosystem built on open standards and open source becomes actually very, very important, so that you get the benefits of it, right? Today, if you talk about silos and stuff like that, you're going to be very constrained within the vendor's own ecosystem if everything is done proprietary, which is going to be very, very difficult to then take and use. In my opinion, I think open source, like what Richard said, open source is the only way to do this, to ensure that standards are adhered to, and also to make sure that it's compatible across the ecosystem
Okay, very
and
good. Okay,
interoperable as well.
now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to create some fire within the panelists. Okay, just now Mei Hui did answer a question about open source and closed source. Now I want to ask Siva now and Richard. In your opinion, should all, and I say all means all government app used by public go through open source strategy?
I would say as much as possible. Yes, why not? Right? I mean, there will be certain business flows and stuff like that that are embedded within code that companies may want to keep proprietary, right? I get that, and that's of course the company's decision. But that's it for most software out there. Let's say, for example, the parking SG app, right? That could be another great candidate for open source because people can just take it and co-develop on that particular platform and make the features even better than what it is today in a much quicker manner, right? We can attract global collaboration, and by doing this, it also puts Singapore on the map of thought leadership, right? To actually share this kind of stuff. That's my opinion.
Okay, Richard, anything supplement?
Can I just quickly jump in on what Siva just said?
Sure.
Oh.
From a government person now.
Back for quite a while, but I think from my perspective, open source means more than just source code. It also means data. So one of the things that we have done in Land Transport Authority, that's my day job, is actually to open source the bus arrival data. We share through API the location and the time data of all the buses in Singapore, the public buses. So you will realize that actually all the bus arrival time apps, whether it's on Android, whether it's on Apple, they all are synchronized. They all use the same data, the exact same data. And that is the outcome that we wanted, because we felt that open sourcing that data allowed more innovation, and it also lowers the barrier of entry, and we have so many innovations today. And that's the direction I hope that the government will go into as well. I mean, not just the source code and all this stuff, but also the data. Yeah, thanks.
Good. Okay, that's a fantastic one. Okay, I don't think you have any else there. I'll ask another question then. How do we ensure that a vendor that develop a commercial product using open source code to fix a vulnerability or bug that's found during our security assessment? Why? Okay, this is very practical. I like this question. Because the response by the vendor will always say, we try to make the application less buggy. We try to fix it ASAP, we try. Try, someone once said this before to me, try has an element of failure. So how do we ensure that they make sure that they do it? Yeah. So maybe anyone?
Yeah, so I think we encounter this kind of challenges or issues from time to time.
Richard, you need a little bit louder from your side. Maybe you need to shout like me.
Like some background, there's I hear some background noise. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Siva.
Okay.
Okay. So I do encounter this thing from time to time, right? So fundamentally, when you engage a vendor, right, there's always a contract that's put in place. There would be a contractual obligation. So all these SLAs in terms of fixing of problems need to be stated very clearly, in the contract. That's the first place, right? But before you actually get into a contractual obligation, I think it is important that you understand the capability of the vendor or whoever that you're engaging with, right? Because a lot of people can say that, I can bring you this software, it's open source, right? But more importantly, you need to understand what is the kind of engineering capability that they have that is part of their organization. Because if they do not have enough engineering capability, then they will be dependent on others, also known as the community, to fix the problem. And if the community have already moved on to newer versions, then this problem will remain there for a long time. Yeah. So first and foremost, do a proper evaluation about the vendor's capability, and to safeguard yourself against such situations, you have to look at the T's and C's within the contract itself.
That's fantastic. Okay, I just want to read some comments. I was really, I think it's quite interesting. Thank you, LTA, for releasing the busing timing via APIs. Yeah, fantastic. Okay, the second thing is that comments. I like those comments though. Government code is paid by tax dollar. So apart from military and national security, everything should be open source. Even Parking SG has to be open source. So I think I agree. I think this panel will also agree also. Oh, you cannot run a smart nation on proprietary software and beholden to some vendors. IoT is critical from a sustainability and security perspective, and therefore proprietary modes will lead to unintended negative consequence. Fantastic. Thank you for your opinion. Okay, I have a question though. where the question runs to? Okay, I think the question disappeared. Let me just move to another question. Okay, this is a very basic question that I think many people who are SMEs today, or even big organizations like MNCs like DBS, they also want to ask this. Okay, so you see, referencing that open source security and risk analysis report by Synopsys, some of the open source contain vulnerability. Of course, the advantage of open source may patch vulnerability quicker. Yes, it's true. But you may be using the older version and the vulnerability already exists and it's already ingrained into your code. So what is the balancing point you think we can reach for this? Because sometimes we don't even know, unless we keep reading, right? We don't even know that the vulnerability is there, but it's already in our code. So what should we do? Maybe I direct this to Mei Hui.
Yeah, so this one is, I would say, it's not a problem just for open source. Even if you have a very proprietary or closed source software, such things can exist. So I would actually recommend that regardless of the kind of software you use, you should do things like security testing and code review from time to time, depending on the how sensitive the data is, or the nature of it. If it's more sensitive, definitely more regular, but probably at least once a year, either an internal or sort of audit, or get actually a vendor to do the scanning and check for you. Because in terms of that, for a lot of the like code reviews, they actually go down to the code level to check whether there are actually this sort of bugs. So that would be helpful even to pick out some of the things that are in proprietary software, I would say. So either black box scanning or just do a full testing.
Okay. Okay, I'll take the last question now. I think we have gone through a lot and some of our brains are fried already. Let me see, okay? Okay, so one of the last question, to follow on Xiaofei's point on data sharing for greater innovation, is there any way to easily search for open APIs, open data APIs that's available in Singapore without going through data.gov.sg or GitHub? Well, I guess we got to get back to you on this. If anyone want to unmute, no, we'll get back to you on this. Good question though. Okay, then maybe I will take one more question. Okay, one more question. Okay, about smart buildings in future. How can URA, for example, provide open source building code for smart building linking homes maybe to a super app? I don't want my information to leak online. For example, when I come home, when I take a bath, when I go to the bathroom, how many times I flush. I don't want all this information to leak online or to access to my home, for example, in a connected home. So how? Maybe I'll just pose this question to the panelists.
I guess just because the app or the super app or the code is open source doesn't mean that your information and data is going to be leaked online, right? This happens in both non-open source and potentially open source development models. I think that's one thing that we need to understand, that we need to be very clear here as well. Just because your software is open source doesn't mean that your data is going to be open as well. Right? It doesn't mean your data can be encrypted. It can be put to use however, right? For example, behind me, I have a Xiaomi robot, right? And the Xiaomi robot maps my entire house, exactly where my toilet is, where my bedroom is, where my sofa is, right? The Xiaomi robot knows because that map is now stored in another country, in the service in another country, right? Are we okay with that? I guess so for the convenience, but that's it. Just because it's open source doesn't mean that the data has to be leaked. And definitely the Xiaomi robot and that software there is not open source. Right. So
I like the differentiation. Doesn't mean it's open source to help the building of the software. Means that the data is being open source, right? I mean, Xiaofei did give an example. Yes, it's because he chose to have the open data access. But I think isn't that like the open trace? I mean, I just want to share. I know that I said I last question, but to Siva, the open trace, right? Isn't it the same concept?
I guess it is the same, right? But OpenTrace, in its sense, at least the original versions, right, was definitely open source, and it followed the Blue Trace protocol that was developed. And true to its protocol, it's actually a very safe and secure platform, right? And by default, anyone looking at the code or willing to inspect the code is going to attribute or confirm that security, which is the reason why this was deployed in other countries as well, not just in Singapore. And that's testament to the original code developers and GovTech for doing that. Great stuff, right? But that said, TraceTogether today is, the versions are not visible to public. I mean, we don't have the code, so we don't know whether the protocols are followed to the T or to the letter, at least as in the way that it was originally intended. We don't know. All we can do is just to trust, right? But then again, trusting a black box versus trusting a box that you can see inside, which would you prefer, right? And which will you, as a citizen or as an organization or as another country, be more assured of? I guess that will be my parting shot.
Okay.
I highly encourage GovTech to continue open sourcing the platform.
Yeah, they have given their blessings also. So I just want, since we have asked all the most of the question, I see I'll ask the last question, right? So lastly, we want to end this session with maybe a 1 minute from each of the panelists. The golden nugget. What will you advise? SMEs or MNC, up to you. If you want to adopt this open source direction, what will you advise them? Caution, or is it encouragement? I will leave the last word to you. So maybe starting from, since just now we spoke from Siva, Mei Hui to Richard, right? Now we go the other way. We start from Richard first. Richard, you're on mute, sorry.
Yeah, okay. So I guess, you know, it's a given, right? That open source is the way to go for, you know, software technologies. And that's where a lot of the innovations is coming from. So instead of having, you know, doubts, fears, worries, please embrace it. Try to understand, you know, how this set of technology work. Try to explore, right? You know, in the community, you know, use your own judgment, right? So looking at the community, how active it is, you know, how many people are using this software, to make an informed decision of whether are you going to use open source or not, right? Honestly, you know, for some of the key core technologies, right? For example, if you're going to the cloud, going use container, Kubernetes is a no-brainer. It's an open source technology developed by Google and is used by hundreds and hundreds of enterprises, right? So, you know, but those are just one of the many examples which you will encounter. So I would encourage that you do your own assessment, and you do this by engaging with the community, going to the projects and look at what's the participation level, right? So that you can make an informed decision.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Richard. Next, Mei Hui.
Yeah, so my opinion is quite similar to Richard. I would personally suggest that do your own due diligence before you use anything. So just a bit of research and have a better understanding, and definitely I would support the use of open source if it's used properly.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Siva, your last word.
I guess definitely, I think open source is the way to go, right? I think for most applications, we try to use as much open source as possible, right? But that's it. Use it with caution, right? I think like what the other panelists have said, both Mei Hui and Richard. Know what you're using, right? And if you don't know what you're using, don't use it, but potentially get vendors to support you. There are options out there. Multiple vendors do support open source software, and use it with your eyes open. I think that's key.
Okay, I think very similar for all panelists. Actually, I have one more thing. I think, Harish, do you have anything, any closing to share, because you're here?
Okay, thanks, Matthias. Well, I think it's great that we had this conversation, if nothing else, but there's significant amount of, to me, the evidence is there's significant amount of interest. At the same time, there's a lot of confusion or insufficient understanding. So I think, you know, kudos to Richard for setting up and running this session, and with the cybersecurity SIG as well. We need to do a lot more education. And clearly, you know, open source is not a marketing activity. It is actually an engineering effort. And if you're not in the game for engineering effort, then don't do that. Just stay in your proprietary side of the house. That's your problem. It's for you to take care of. Don't involve the rest of the community.
Thank you so much. Okay, that's a very good nugget to take away. Okay, I will hand it over to Richard to close the session. Thank you so much, everyone.
Right, thanks, Matthias. Well, you know, we are almost at the end of our session, right? So it was a interesting chat. Thanks everyone for attending, you know, today's webinar. and panel discussion and for all the different questions. And I would like to thank Xiaofei, Matthias, for actually arranging this together with the open source SIG. Right, thanks Siva for taking time out. I know you have been a great help, adding your many cents worth right into this conversation. And Mei Hui, appreciate your expert opinion on security and how it can actually work with the open source software, right? And the likes. Yeah. So in short, I think it has been a very interesting session. I thought we are going to flesh out what's next events, right? So, but anyway, since you are here, SCS organizes a lot of events, so please keep a lookout, on our websites to attend the next session together with us. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a great evening ahead. Yeah. Bye.
Bye.